Dumpster Fire, Jay Dyer
Mm,
destroyed. That's Premiere.
that's the premiere, so it should be a new one, a stream live.
I don't see it. Are you able to copy me the link?
I'll go to it and check right now because I don't have it up either.
Here, it might just be that I'm not subscribed. If I subscribe, maybe it'll come up in my notifications.
I think it's
if
just
I
like a
reload.
30-second delay or something before it goes to restream and then it goes to YouTube.
Ah, okay. Yeah, I've never used Restream. I just do it all directly through Streamlabs, like the actual OBS Streamlabs application.
Yeah, I do it just to Streamlabs, from Streamlabs to Restream, so I can stream it to YouTube, Facebook, Twitch, Twitter.
Oh, yeah, that's smart. Okay, that's a good idea.
Yeah, it looks like we're live. 12 watching now. Comments. Is the sound,
oh, yeah, here, I see it.
Is the sound good?
Okay, perfect.
Error theorists, no. Error theorists are dumb.
Share that out. Does your audience think I'm an error theorist?
I don't know. He was just Sully was asking, is that the topic of the conversation? Because that's usually what we talk about.
Yeah, that's funny. Well, yeah, we should do that conversation, and that's not the topic for today. But we should have the moral semantics conversation. But we'll whatever. Let's not fucking down that rabbit.
I just did a debate on morality, which is like the most up to date version, where I actually explained it the clearest I think I have so far. So if you check that out, that would be a good review. Sully says, yes, I think you are an error theorist.
Well, no, I'm not an error theorist. I mean, it depends. I guess it depends on what conception of morality we're talking about. I mean, but whatever. Let's not get into that.
Yes, today we're talking about how dumb Jay Dyer is, because it's such a golden topic. I mean, he goes even past the level of Darth Dawkins. It's impressive. I got to give him credit for that.
Yeah, I mean, Jay Dyer, there's a special, property that he has that, it's like a presuppositional paradigmatic quality of Jay's, which just allows people like TJump and I to come together to laugh at him. So, it's really great. So, I mean, I've written down a handful of things. We can just kind of talk about them, and you can mention the ones you have. Like, obviously, Jay Dyer, for the record, my history with him, I debated him once on Vegan Gains channels years ago. I knew a lot less about Phil at that point, which I still don't really think I know that much. And I still completely pwned him then. I wrecked him again with a critique Malpass gave me in its Discord server. So he just fears me. He won't engage me. Multiple people have tried to get him to debate. Politics has tried to do it. Didn't fucking happen. Recently, though, I managed to set up a debate without his knowledge of him versus Detroyer, who I guess you saw just completely destroy him.
Yeah. Was that the one you guys were reviewing with Malpass?
Yes, that's right. That's right. And Detroyer, at one point he said the impossibility of the contrary, right? All worldviews that aren't the Christian worldview are contradictory. And the second he said that, I knew he was just dead, right? Because Detroyer is just going to be like, oh, what's the contradiction? And then he just wouldn't be able to derive it. And of course he didn't. He just tried to waffle and red herring and ramble for the whole rest of the discussion. And it was humiliating.
Yeah.
But then I saw his debate with you. And I mean, I do have to give you credit. Like, you really, really triggered him quite exquisitely. It was great to watch.
Thank you. I'll take that compliment. My skills at triggering. Right.
So, yeah, I've written down like a handful of things because he just said so much stupid shit in that discussion. So, I mean, are there any, before I fucking ramble off, like, is there anything you want to say about it? Any things you want to point out?
Maybe. I mean, I'm actually more interested in your guys' review of the last one. Like, you guys seem to like really struggle with trying to understand what his argument really was. Like, because obviously you got it right. It's like his modus ponens. It's impossible to have knowledge if God doesn't exist. We have knowledge, therefore God exists. But the part you guys seem to get stuck on is what is his justification for premise one, and what he's trying to do to justify that is he's going to list off all of the biggest problems in philosophy and say only God can solve these problems. Like, each problem is kind of like a guess who of this person is blonde, this person does not have glasses, and you just knock off all the lists. And he thinks that the solution to all of those problems eliminates all other possibilities except God. And he calls that a contradiction. It's not really a contradiction. It's just would be a false answer if he was correct, which he's not. But the argument he's going for is when he lists all of these different problems in philosophy, he's trying to say that these eliminate all of the different alternatives that could be the foundational metaphysical grounds of reality except God. That's the core of his argument. It's really weird because all the problems he lists aren't necessarily related at all. They're just a bunch of random problems in philosophy. But,
Well,
go ahead.
No, go ahead. It's fine.
But yeah, so there's just a bunch of random problems in philosophy. I mean, I can recognize his argument because I've researched all the different problems and tried to like classify them into my little epistemology thing, so I can recognize his argument pretty clearly. That's essentially what all pre-suppers are doing. They're just saying, here's a list of all the big problems we can't solve in philosophy. You can't solve them. God can, therefore God. That's the premise of their argument.
Yeah, well, I think that actually Jay moves between different arguments, and it's ambiguous what he's saying. I agree that there's often a kind of core to it, which is something like, if we have these things, which he calls transcendentals, and it's kind of this weird category of things, like, there's like logical laws and numbers and what else is in there? Like the
reason, morality,
of the external world, sure, objective morality, it's just this big cluster of things he calls transcendentals. And it's like, if we have these things, God is the only thing that could account for all of those, right? And we do have those things, and so God's the only thing that can account for them. And he gets to God existing by some inference, like roughly like that. But of course, it's like just granting that all these things are the case, kind of like what Troy did, right? Like, sure, let's be like realists about morality and this and that and the other thing. Why is God the only thing that can account for them? I agree that that's like the general kind of response, but I also just think it's ambiguous what his argument is a lot of the time, because he moves into other like, it's never formalized, you never really know, but it's not clear that he's always making that same argument. He seems to waffle around.
Well, I would disagree there, because I think that both of the two different types of arguments that Malpass describes him as making, like the epistemological and ontological versions of his argument, for him, they're the same thing, because knowledge is a transcendental, one of those transcendental categories. So he thinks it has its own ontology, kind of like a Platonic object. And so for him, he's really just making the ontological version, which Malpass called like a version of the contingency argument, which I don't think it is exactly, but for him, it's the same argument, and both knowledge and the possibility of knowledge are entailed in the ontology of this Platonic object, of this transcendental that is grounded in a God. So when it seems like he's making the two different arguments, it's just his bad phrasing, because he doesn't know what the words mean. And that's why he brings up the two dogmas of empiricism and the myth of the given. He thinks those are metaphysical problems when they're really not. They're about distinctions between our sense experience and our conceptions in our head. But he thinks they are. So that's why he brings them up.
Well, you could argue that there's always one argument at the core of it, and it's just his poor expression that leads it to look like different arguments. But like, I'm just picturing, like, sometimes the argument seems something like, if transcendentals exist, God exists. Transcendentals exist, therefore God exists. Or then other times it's like, if every worldview except the Christian worldview is contradictory, then the Christian worldview is true. Every worldview except the Christian worldview is contradictory, therefore the Christian worldview is true. Now, you might, like, if you want to try to say he's always just trying to articulate one thing, it's just his poverty of language that leads him to sound like he's making different arguments. That could be true. I'm not sure, but
that's exactly
we can probably agree it gets articulated as different seeming arguments, right?
Oh, definitely. The problem is when pre-suppers use the word contradiction, what they mean is not the correct answer. So anything that is not the correct answer to them is a contradiction by definition. So when he says every worldview is a contradiction, all he's saying is that every worldview can't answer the transcendentals. Those two terms are synonymous for him in every case. So when he's trying to make those two arguments, it's just the same argument and his bad usage of words.
Well, I've never seen a pre-supper who has a grasp on basic logic. So I think that that's probably in part why you hear them throw around words like contradiction where they obviously don't belong. I don't know if you saw my last conversation with Darth Dawkins. It's not really, it's a bit off topic, but it's kind of similar where, like, there's ambiguous language usage, and when you try to get clarity, it results in him getting mad. So what he said was that, so I go into this room, right? Darth is in there, and he kind of picks me out and starts like calling me out to debate him, right? It's the thing he does, whatever. He's like, oh, I see. Ask yourself is here. So, ask yourself, do you want to defend atheism? And so I pipe up. I'm like, well, I'm an agnostic, so I defend that, I guess. It's like, oh, well, agnosticism is incoherent or agnosticism is contradictory or whatever. I was like, okay, well, wait, what's the argument that agnosticism is contradictory? And, in typical pre-supper style, Darth rambles on without giving premises and a conclusion. But at some point in what is meant to be his argument for the proposition that agnosticism is contradictory, what was it that he said there? He was saying that you either affirm that God exists or you deny that God exists, right? And I said, well, wait a second. What does affirm and deny mean there? Because if affirm means believe that God exists and deny means don't have a belief that God exists, then sure, that's true, but I don't see how you're going to get to your conclusion, right? Like what's the contradiction? Just being just not having a belief, right? But if it means you either believe that it's true that God exists or you believe it's false that God exists, well, then it just seems like you're basically begging the question, because you're just ruling out agnosticism in one of your premises for the argument that's supposed to rule out agnosticism. You follow me there?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that's, again, just Darth not understanding logic. He's just using words that make him feel good to try and describe his position without actually describing his position.
Yeah, it's so the lack of understanding of logic is the cringe thing. So I guess let's get into some of these things about Jay. So, and I mean, I'll just go through my list and just cut me off anywhere you want or make whatever points you want whenever. So, all right. So one of the things he was saying was, and I have a few kind of quotes or rough quotes that are, getting at the same point. In a formal argument, you can't appeal to an informal fallacy. Formal arguments have nothing to do with appealing to experts. You can't appeal to authority in a formal argument, right? So this is just entirely false, right? Like you could make a formal argument that has some stupid, it might not be a strong argument because the premise could be easily false or something, but you could make a formal argument where one of the premises is something like, if the experts in physics say X, then X is probably true. Right? Those are propositions. Of course you can use those in an argument. So what the fuck is he talking about?
Well, I think he's trying to make the argument that if it's just valid, so A equals B, B equals C, C equals A, well, then you can't bring up that it's an invalid argument or an informal fallacy, because it's strictly just a valid argument. And so it's not about the soundness isn't in question here because we don't know what the premises are. So in that context, what he thinks he's saying is that it's just valid. You can't bring up an informal fallacy for an argument for just a valid structured formal argument. And I think he's confusing that with just because it's valid, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's necessarily a formal argument in that sense. And that's where I think he's making that strange confusion between terms.
Well, it seems like he thinks that when he says appeal to an informal fallacy, I guess it's ambiguous what he means, but the only point that I want to convey is that, of course, you could make a formal argument that in its premises has something like an appeal to authority or a straw man, right? You could formalize a straw man of someone's argument. And so we agree on that point, right? So
yeah, absolutely. But the point he was making, because again, he's just terrible with language. What he's saying is that if you have a deductive argument, it doesn't matter what the authorities say on it. Their opinion doesn't have any effect on the truth or falsity or the validity of the deductive argument. That's the argument he's trying to make with stupid words. And he's saying just the validity of the argument, like any deductive argument, Socrates is a man, all men are mortal, Socrates is mortal, the consensus has no effect on that. So he says you can't use that informal, is the word he uses, fallacy to try and critique the deductive form of his argument. That's the argument he's trying to make.
Okay, well, if we're going to be charitable and we're going to assume that that's what he means, which could be what he means, then okay. But I was just, when I saw it and I saw formal arguments have nothing to do with appealing to experts, I was just like, I just don't understand. So if all he's saying is that, the experts agreeing on some proposition doesn't make the form invalid or something, we can be charitable and assume he's saying something like that. But as long as, so we do agree though that regardless of what the correct interpretation of Jay is,
his words are dumb as shit. Oh God, he's so dumb.
Okay, so here's another one. He said it's not clear what an expert is. It's okay, well, I mean, you can always say there's some ambiguity about who the experts are, but I mean, are we really going to question that the people who've acquired like, you know, PhD degrees in physics are like the experts in physics? Like, is that really in question?
Yeah,
It's really in question
he's
that,
probably making some kind of identity argument. Like in evolution, it's kind of hard to draw the lines between one species and another because you get like ring species, and so it's kind of ambiguous. But we can clearly tell the difference between like a bat and an elephant. So we can clearly say here are the experts in this category, and there may be some like blurred line between which ones really finally qualify at the smallest level. But we can clearly tell what an expert is as opposed to a non-expert. That's an obvious difference. So
yeah, it's like a sorties kind of thing.
Yep. The problem of the heat.
Again, you're very charitable to Jay. Like, yeah, I could see you being right about the first one, where he's just saying, you know, what the experts think has nothing to do with if the argument's valid, but not clear what an expert is. I don't know if he's doing a sorties thing there, but yeah, let's just assume he's doing something that's like a sorties kind of argument. I mean, of course, presumably we can tell the difference between like, you know, some like mentally disabled like 5-year-old child and like some like, you know, a PhD in like astrophysics.
And we can tell the difference between Jay Dyer and Alex Malpass, definitely.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Okay, so here's another one. When you make a formal argument, this is different than when you're making arguments about factual claims. What the fuck are you talking about? You can make a formal argument about factual claims.
Yeah, I'm not sure how to interpret that one. I don't know what he's saying.
Come on, give me the charitable defense. So, I mean, that I don't understand. It's like when you make a formal argument, this is different than when you're making an argument about factual claims. It's like, does Jay think you can't make a formal argument about factual claims? Are formal arguments supposed to be about non-factual claims? Like
is a formal argument not a fact? I don't get it. But I mean, I think
I almost this is uncharitable, I guess, but it might even be so bad as like he's confused about the distinction between like an a priori argument and like a formal argument, and he thinks that there's something about like maybe he's talking about like analyticity, and he's thinking about things that are true like just in virtue of their meaning and not like, you know, observations we make out there in the world. Like maybe it's something like that.
I think that's right. I think what he's trying to make a distinction between is a priori truths that you can know just by thinking about it versus what he would call like contingent truths, like the earth is round or something like that you need sense experience to verify. So I think that is probably the correct interpretation of what he was going for.
But whether he's talking about like analyticity, a priority, or whatever it may be, it's like, I mean, you can make formal arguments in all those domains. You can make like a formal argument about something analytic. Like if X is a triangle, X has 3 sides, X is a triangle, therefore X has 3 sides. Like it's analytic that a triangle has 3 sides, but that's still like a sound formal argument about a triangle, right?
Yeah, I just don't think he knows what a formal argument actually is. And he's just using the word as kind of like a virtue signaling to say this category is bigger or better than that category. And so you can't compare the two.
I agree. So here's another, I know we're going to agree on this because you were fighting him on this, but reality is an argument. Where the fuck are the premises and conclusions, right? It's like you kept asking him, right? Where's the therefore, Jay? Like, where's the therefore? Like, he doesn't understand. An argument has to have premises and a conclusion. And the conclusion is marked with a therefore or a so or something like that.
Right, the 3 little dot symbol that he used in his little board thing.
Right, exactly. So yeah, there's not much to say about that. It's just obviously not an argument. It's like just the stupidest thing. And he was really planting his feet in the mud about it too. I was like, what the fuck are you doing? It's a valid form.
Oh yeah, he was calling it a circular argument too. Like, that's a circular argument. Like, what?
Just, yeah, right. It's like, well, it has to be an argument to be a circular argument. Like I could see thinking there's some connection of like, it's a tautology, and this circular argument maybe seems somehow like a tautology. Like technically all arguments can be expressed as tautologies if you conjoin the premises and imply the conclusion. Like you can make modus ponens into a tautology by going like P implies Q and P implies Q, and that statement comes out true in all possible worlds. But like he doesn't mean anything interesting like that, so he's just an idiot. So here. Sorry, were you going to say something?
Oh, I mean, just to mention, like, he doesn't understand the difference between a tautology as just saying the same thing twice.
Right.
And tautology and logic, which is if no matter how you rearrange the truth value of the premises, the conclusion is always true.
Well, something like that. Yeah, that's not quite. It's not. But of course, you appreciate the formal. So you actually said it right in the debate. I believe you said something that's evaluates to true in all possible worlds. So here's where I might. Actually, I don't know if I can find quickly maybe I can do a truth table for. See if I can just find a truth table of a tautology statement. Just 1 second here. Truth table for tautology, because there's a really easy way to understand these. I would have to go looking, so I'm not gonna hold people up right now. I wish I had a generator that could do WFFs and not just arguments. Whatever. Okay, so here's the next one. So I wrote this as "it's a valid form." Lol, what's the form? so it's like this was just hilarious. Like he was just insisting that the argument has a valid form, which like we'll get into that. It's not actually valid as written, but there's a charitable interpretation by which it could be a valid argument. And
as written, you mean on his little whiteboard, that written one?
Yeah, that doesn't directly translate into a valid argument, but if you were charitable, you could see what he's like going for, though. But the thing is, though, when you say it's a valid form, it's like the reply is just like, well, what the fuck's the form, right? And he wouldn't be able to give you the form, right? Because the form should be, his answer should come in the form of nomenclature for some formal system, right? Like if you have to specify the form, I mean, obviously there's shorthand for some of the forms, like it's modus ponens, hypothetical syllogism, right? Something like that. But either way, it's like those are just shorthands for things that can be expressed in the nomenclature of, in that case, like propositional logic, right? Like his answer should be something like P or Q, not P, therefore Q, or like, P implies Q, not Q, therefore not P, right? Like if you asked him to specify the form, like he would just completely faceplant. He would just try to say the argument at you or something. He wouldn't be able to.
He didn't do that. He just said it's like a disjunctive form or something. I think that's what he said.
I have that written down too.
But my bigger problem here was that I didn't ask anything about the form. I said, well, what's the first premise of the argument? And he's like, well, the form is, I'm like, what? And I kept asking, so wait, what is a valid argument? And then he said, well, a valid argument is one where the conclusions follow from the premise. And so in order to have that, I was like, so you need premises, right? What's the first premise? And then he kept going, well, the form is. I'm like, is that the first premise? Like, what are you talking about?
Right. Yeah, it's like if it's an argument, there should be premises. And at one point he says it's not a syllogism. And you could be super charitable and assume by syllogism he meant like an Aristotelian, like categorical syllogism or something, like all men are mortal, this kind of thing. But I think
it clearly is. I mean, like it's obviously just a simple, just moral argument, William Lane Craig. If God doesn't exist, you can't have knowledge. We have knowledge, therefore God exists. But the fact that he hasn't been able to figure that out in the 20 years he's been doing this is hilarious.
Well, yeah, I don't think he knows basic logic. So the other thing is, so let's talk about his argument for a second. So the actual argument, let's see, you sent it to me on Twitter. I also took a photo, but now I've forgotten. You phrased it in his phrasing, though, at one point. I want to look at his phrasing first.
Something like, we have knowledge claims. That was the first part.
Oh, yeah. There's a hilarious part in there where he kept articulating the second premise as just a noun, like knowledge or something. And you kept tripping out. You're like, wait, what's the second? Because you're expecting, obviously, a proposition, like we have knowledge or something. And then finally, after like 10 tries where he kept saying it's like knowledge claims, it's like, it's not a proposition. That can't be, it's not an argument. Like, or sorry, I shouldn't say it's not an argument. It's like, that can't be a premise because that's not a proposition. It's just a noun, or it's like just a thing, right? The premise can't be shoe, or like my premise can't be like guitars or something like that, or knowledge claims. It has to be a proposition, like we have knowledge claims, or like there are true knowledge, or whatever the fuck. Okay, so let me just find.
Yeah, well, he actually started just by saying the first premise and then his conclusion. He said it's not possible to have knowledge claims without God, therefore God exists. That was his first construction of the argument, which was just hilarious. Like, okay,
yeah,
wait, what?
Yeah, I don't know. Like, he kept kind of like, he was like almost saying the conclusion and second premise at the same time. Oh, okay. I found a picture of it here. So Z is the condition of A, therefore Z. So that doesn't actually like directly formalize. That's not like written such that, like, if I say like if I'm talking to Tom, we're talking about philosophy. I'm talking to Tom, therefore we're talking about philosophy. That directly translates into, like, without having to move any letters around or do any interpretive work. That's just P implies Q, P therefore Q. You have to do interpretive work on this to see what he means. But, you know, presumably, again, like presumably what he's saying is something like, if we have knowledge, then God exists. We have knowledge, therefore God exists. So it's like something like that. Or you just structured it as like a modus tollens, but you could get at the same kind of thing, right? Yeah. Like there's some charitable interpretation like that. So the next thing to point out is he kept saying it's a disjunctive argument. So no, it's not. Do you understand what it means to say an argument is disjunctive?
It's an or statement, either or.
Right. So, like, do you know, like, disjunctive syllogism?
P or Q, not P, therefore Q.
Like right. That. Yeah, exactly. So there's no disjunction in his argument. Where's the or? So why is he calling it a disjunctive argument? There's not an or in it anywhere.
Yeah, maybe he's going for like the classic argument from incredulity. Like, I can't imagine X. If X was true, I could imagine it. Therefore, X isn't true. Kind of something like that. That could be what he's going for if he just doesn't realize it. Because that would be an example.
Wait, say that again. Sorry.
It's a classic argument from incredulity. It's like, I can't imagine how X, if X were true, I could imagine it. Therefore, X isn't true.
Wait, if X were true, I'd be able to imagine it. I can't imagine it, therefore X isn't true.
Something like that, yeah.
But that's just modus tollens. Yeah, that's not disjunctive either. You need, for a disjunction,
so
it's got to have
like,
an or something.
Either I can imagine it or I can't imagine it. I can't imagine it, therefore it's not true, something like that.
Well, that wouldn't be valid, but that would at least have a disjunction in it. Like, it's like either I can imagine it or it's not true. Either I can't imagine. I can't even think of it because it sounds stupid. It's like, okay, what kind of thing could you try to say? You could try to say that.
Well, it's like Jay's argument that imagine, like, all the other worlds you can't do this, but mine can, kind of a thing. So either my worldview can do it and theirs can't, or something like that. It seems like
just. I could make it a disjunctive syllogism. It's going to be stupid, but you could just be like, either I can imagine it or it's not true. It's not the case that I can imagine it. Therefore, it's the case that it's true.
Yeah,
right.
That's pretty much it.
Wait, did I say that right? I might have accidentally put a negation in there somewhere. But the point is just, it's got to be a disjunctive argument has to have a fucking or statement in it. His doesn't have an or in it, so it's not a disjunctive argument. We kind of covered this one already. It's an argument, but he said his language was, I'm not putting it in a premise. It's like, well, sorry, arguments have premises. So, like, he eventually gave premises, but he seemed to not. I think, honestly, that he doesn't understand where the premises are in that little blurb he wrote up. I think it's like all a loose, like, cloud to him or something.
Yeah, I think so. That's why I got him when he said it was valid. So if it's valid, it's got to have premises. So he's got to give a premise now because he already said it was valid. So that's how I got him to give an argument finally.
Yeah, right. Well, yeah, eventually. And he kind of played it like he always knew there has to be premises. But earlier he said, like, you could be so charitable when he made the statements, I'm not putting it in a premise and it's not a syllogism. You could be like, he's just at this moment not stating the premise and it's just not an Aristotelian categorical syllogism. But, you know, a pretty reasonable read is just that he doesn't know what, like, you know, what fucking syllogisms and premises and formal arguments really are in any clear way. So
yeah, I think that's probably more accurate.
We'll leave it to people to guess. So we've also covered this one already. You already brought it up. Second premise is knowledge, right? It's not a proposition. So it's like that can't be a premise. Like, for anyone who's watching who doesn't follow this kind of stuff, it's like,
I mean, one, I think it's fair to be charitable and say he meant we have knowledge and he just didn't articulate
especially
it.
Once he clarified it. Yeah, that's fine. But it was still
I've done that too. I mean, I've done that in our conversations where you ask, like, what is morality? And I just list the involuntary imposition of will or whatever, because I did specifically mean morality is the involuntary imposition of will. I just didn't say the first part. So it's that, I mean, that's a fair thing to say, just to say the noun instead of the what is, like in Jeopardy.
Well, I think it's fair to do what I did in that conversation and what you did to Jay, which was to ask the person to clarify.
Yeah, that's fair.
And when he did clarify, you're perfectly charitable about it, which I think is fine, and which I would do for you in this situation also. So I think that's all fine. But, like, yeah, so it was funny, though, because it's just one of those things where like someone who knows logic, right? They would never repeatedly state a premise as just by just stating a thing, right? Instead of a proposition. Like they would be sensitive to the fact that like obviously what's like I'm watching this and it's completely obvious to me what's tripping out. You're tripping out because it's not a proposition. He's just saying a word at you. You're like, wait, like what? And then the funny part was finally he says, we have knowledge. And you go, oh, okay, I understand. That's not what you said before. And he goes, it is what I said. And it's like, well, like maybe it's what you meant. We'll be charitable, but it's not what you said, right? Tom was right when he said, you didn't say that before. I could go back and play it. If you go back and play it, it wasn't until you pressed him repeatedly that he finally gave it as a proposition.
Yeah, I think he was complaining that he said the first premise over and over and just thought that was good enough to imply his whole argument. So when he was saying he said it like 5 times, he just meant the first premise and he thought that was just good enough to express the entire argument. And I think that's where the mistake he's making is that just saying the first premise doesn't count as everyone else just understanding your argument.
Yes, I think that could be the case. I don't have many more here. So this is a really funny one. So Jay believes in circular arguments. So that was hilarious. I'm glad you got him to say that. So I kind of said this to you in text, but there's like a little handful of statements that you can get pre-suppers to make a lot of the time. And these are the kind of statements where, like, honestly, I understand you were on whatever track you were on. I would have, the second he said this, that would have been the only thing I'd have talked about for the rest of the conversation. Maybe I'm an asshole like that. I don't know. But there's this little handful of things that pre-suppers often say. And these are just the, like, once they say that, they're completely fucked if the other person knows, like, anything about logic kind of statements. So one example is the one he made in his discussion with Detroyer, where he said, the impossibility of the contrary, right? If you say all worldviews that aren't Christian are contradictory or impossible, that means you got some way to derive a contradiction for every other worldview, right? How the fuck are you going to do that?
Yeah.
And then this is another really good example where you say, I believe in circular arguments, which presumably he doesn't want to accept all. You never hear someone say that who accepts all circular arguments, right? He was complaining about something you said being a circular argument, even though it wasn't, because he didn't understand the distinction between a tautology and a circular argument. But
right, even the moderator brought that up. He's like, isn't that inconsistent? Because weren't you complaining that he was making a circular argument?
Yeah, the little note for the moderator. The moderator said something at one point like it doesn't. It's not an argument. It's like an equation. It's like no it's supposed to be an argument. And when you use, like, you know this obviously, but when you use some kind of nomenclature from a formal system, that's just representing the argument. It's not like the nomenclature isn't an argument.
Right. He just didn't know philosophy, so to him it just looks like an equation, and he made a distinction between the two.
Yeah, I don't think he was being bad faith or anything. Although the not muting at some points was a little AIDS, but whatever. I can understand it. That's how they run their show. So believing in circular arguments. So obviously the reply to this is just, well, how do you distinguish between virtuously and viciously circular arguments? And they have no answer, right? It's like, they'll tell you stupid shit like, well, virtuously circular arguments are arguments like at a paradigmatic level. It's like, well, wait,
just direct quote from Jay right there.
Right, or Darth will say a similar thing. Virtuously circular arguments are arguments about an ultimate. It's like, but once you press for clarity though, and you go, okay, well, what exactly is the definition of, like paradigmatic level, right? Like what makes for that? And then once you have a definition, you can just try to like find a counterexample where, okay, well, like I can make an argument like that's circular and it's just not about God, like very easily, and they just won't accept it, right? And it's like, well, this fits your criteria for virtuous circularity, right? Like often they won't even be able to give you a clear criteria, but if they do, like there's a reason fucking philosophers don't like circular arguments, right? There's not a way to do this satisfactorily, to give some criteria for virtuous circularity where everyone's like, yeah, seems legit. So it's like, if they even succeed at giving you a criteria, you're going to be able to find like counter examples to it that look hilarious, like trivially easily.
Have you actually read the paper on vicious versus virtuous circularity?
No. What paper are you talking about?
There is actually an academic paper which does try to make distinctions. I don't fully understand it, but I can get it for you. I have it saved on my epistemology worksheet.
Sure, yeah, I'd be happy to read it. Check that out.
Yeah, I'll show you.
I highly doubt they make the distinction successfully, but I will keep my mind wide open. Another one here is that Jay seemed confused by the Phil Papers survey. So he seemed to be like
There's no
Like,
consensus. Like, what?
it's just crazy because it's like the whole thing is like this is just trying to assess like what the opinions of philosophers are. Like, does he think that polling is like not an effective way to get a sense of what the consensus is in some field?
Yeah,
Like, is he just triggered? It's almost like he's just triggered by you saying his position isn't consensus. Why not just own it and be like, yeah, like I hold a minority position, but I think it's correct. Why get triggered by it not being consensus and try to like deny that the general consensus in philosophy is not in favor of theism? Like, what's the issue there?
yeah, I think that's one of the things theists really it aggravates them, like him and inspiring philosophy, especially because what they're doing is just cherry picking some kind of minutiae academic papers from Van Til, or in IP's case, some crazy physicist, and saying, here's evidence for our position, but not considering the fact that the broader field all thinks that's crap. And so when you bring that up, it just completely undermines their entire worldview, and they take offense to that quite vigorously, and they don't like it very much, and so they call it an argument from authority. I remember he said that. I was like, what fallacy is this, Jay? It's an argument from authority. And he just doesn't know what an argument from authority is. Like, clearly it's not, because just Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy on fallacies, number 9. It's just, if it's an actual authority, it's not a fallacy. So they hate that so much because it so easily undermines their worldview and their entire methodology for trying to construct a justification for their worldview.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that when you talk about appealing to authority, like it is always going to be a fallacy to say something is true because the experts say it. But I understand the distinction you're making, that you have like strong inductive support for a claim being true when there's expert consensus on that claim. And that, that's, we would call that, like, we wouldn't say that's an unreasonable kind of thing to do. Like, normally when you're calling someone out for an appeal to authority, it's either like they're appealing to someone who's not an authority, or they're making way too strong a claim, like that X is true because an expert says it, not like X is like, more probable to be true because experts think it, or something like that.
Right. Even in that case, I think it can be true. Like the God case, if there was a God and the God said something is true and he's the ultimate authority, that could actually be a valid, sound argument potentially. So it isn't necessarily fallacious to even say that in certain cases, that it's true because the authority says so, if it is an actual authority.
Well, I mean, if you define actual authority such that what they say is like definitionally true, like with God or something, it's like if appealing to the thing that determines what is truth is like what is meant by an appeal to authority, then like, okay, like you can't like
J.K. Rowling in Harry Potter or Lord of the Rings and J.R.R. Tolkien, like that would be a valid appeal to authority.
Yeah, I think that they would determine what's true within their own universe. Sure.
Yeah.
So then the only other thing I want to do, this isn't so much about the Jay debate. Those are my comments. Like the overall picture is just like, he doesn't know about logic. He seemed confused about what an argument is. His argument had, an extremely sketchy first premise. Once you formalize it charitably, he seemed to be confused about what things like tautology are, or circular arguments. He didn't seem to understand like that, we can talk about experts. He just seemed confused on so many levels. It was hard to even
didn't know what the 2 dogmas of empiricism were, doesn't know what Quine wrote, doesn't know what Kant said, doesn't know what the Bertrand Russell's criticism of I think therefore I am is. Like that one was actually really interesting. The one where he said, I think therefore I am presupposes language and logic and that kind of stuff. Because precepts think that language and logic somehow exist prior to the argument, and you're just trying to grasp these Platonic concepts when you're forming the argument. And you can actually just say, no, I don't presuppose any of that stuff. I just make up all those languages based off of qualia experience, and that's perfectly reasonable. So you don't actually have to presuppose those things, except in some kind of pragmatic sense of you're just using them to form the argument. So I think that was a really interesting part that precepts don't understand, is that presupposing the use of language doesn't actually entail that language existed prior to the formulation of the argument.
I would have to give some thought to that. I don't think I have anything to say to that right there. The only other thing that I thought might be interesting is, do you know how to interpret truth tables for propositional logic?
I mean, how to look at them and see if the first row is all true, then the conclusion will be true? Like, what do you mean interpret?
Like how to read a truth table and tell if it's valid?
Not off the top of my head. I think it's just if you look to see if the premises follow the conclusion, right? So if the premises are all true, then the conclusion is true, and if the premises are false, then the conclusion will be false, kind of thing.
I felt like I'd want to show you how to do this because you find, like, honestly, you would find it super useful to catch people out on some of these things. And I know that you have a tendency to like you like to get them on the minutia of when their logical structure is wrong or they're fucking up in some way there. So it might be interesting. So I'm going to screen share you something because it's actually an incredibly straightforward thing. You'll get it right away. So can you see my screen share there?
I got a black screen. Now I see it. Now I see it.
Okay. Right. So this is like the truth table for modus ponens, right? P implies Q, P therefore Q. So if you look at this right here, the variables table, what that's doing is it's capturing all possible truth values for the variables. Now, keep in mind, this is a bivalent logic where something's either true, 1, or false, 0. Like you have many
valued logics and yeah.
Right, of course. So now you can tell there's only 4 options here, right? Kind of like if you had 2 light switches, like both on, both off, one on and the other off, the other on and the one off. Can you appreciate that?
Basic matrix, you get one table for each premise, essentially. A variable or whatever. Yeah.
You get a with two variables that can each have one value, you get there's only 4 options. There's not like if you're in the audience and you think there's more, please think of what other combinations there are. So the idea is just we're capturing all combinations possible. And then the argument is going to, this part's the argument, right, with premises and conclusion, obviously. The argument, its premises and conclusion are going to evaluate to have certain values under these truth conditions. So the way that you'd want to read the table to see if the argument is valid is you just want to look if there's any row in the argument, so any possible world, any set of truth values for the variables, where the conclusions both get or the premises both get a 1, true, and the conclusion gets a 0, right? So as you can see, there's no such row here with modus ponens. You following me so far?
Yep. So if there's a row with just 1s for all of the variables, but a 0 for the conclusion, then it's not valid.
1 for both the premises. Here, I'll generate you one. So let's do like affirming the consequent, right? So like,
yeah.
Check P implies Q, Q, therefore P.
It's actually abduction. Abduction is all affirming the consequent.
Wait, what?
Abduction is affirming the consequent. The formal structure for abduction is affirming the consequent.
Okay, that I feel like I'm not sure about that, but that would turn into a whole discussion. So I might
have that one too sometime.
Pardon me?
We should have that one too sometime. But just check it out. It's actually just straight off the philosophy, Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. But yeah.
Okay, that's just something I haven't given any thought to. But like either way, we don't like consequent affirmation because it's invalid, right? So like here's like P implies Q, Q therefore P. So you might notice like this big glaring red row, right, where both of the premises evaluate to true and the conclusion evaluates to false. You see that?
Yep. So like the grass is wet and it rains, or if it rains, the grass is wet, therefore it rained. Right.
Yeah. Yeah. So the point is just that like that's an instance, or like another is like if I'm at Walmart, I'm not at home. I'm not at home, therefore I'm at Walmart. That's like a consequent affirmation.
And you could just be at Target, and then the two premises would be true, and the conclusion would be false.
Right, like something should immediately stand out as kind of sketchy about an argument like that. And then the only other thing I want to do is just tell you how to generate the tables, because it's so useful. So like you can see obviously how we derive the truth values in the argument. So first of all, the variables table, there's not an order to how you have to fill it out. There's an easy way to make sure you get all the truth values, but this is just it's like just useful procedurally. It's theoretically, this table here, the variables table, could be in any order, but often people go 1 0 1 0 and then 1 1 0 0, and then if there's a third 1 1 1 1 0 0 0 0, then if there's a fourth, 8 1s 8 0s, so on and so forth. But the idea of the variables table, you'd be able to do this all on your own, right? Because you can think of how many combinations there are for P and Q, and you could write out all the combinations. So you'd understand that much already, right?
Yep.
Yeah, so then when it comes to the argument, right, obviously we've just separated the premises and the conclusion. When it comes to filling out Q, well, what are the truth values for Q in each world? Well, it's just going to be the same as in the variables column because it's just Q, right?
Yep.
So that you can tell how we got Q and P. And then the only question is, what do you do with these kind of statements when you have like an implication? Or here, let's do another argument we talked about. Let's go check P or Q, not Q, therefore P, disjunctive syllogism, right? This is another.
Were you typing that? Okay, there you go. Yeah, we couldn't see
I'm bringing them all up for you. Yeah, so like this is, you can tell again, this is valid. There's no row here where you get ones and then a zero. But like how would you evaluate the truth value of this, right? So you can tell what we did here. P, obviously, it's just the same as P. Not Q, well, it's just going to be the opposite of Q, right? Not Q is going to have opposite truth values to Q. Does that make sense?
Yep. I've done all this before. I used to study logic. I didn't find it as useful as you do.
Yeah. Well, I find it super useful. I was going to just say how to get the truth value for these compound statements. Would you rather not?
No, go for it.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So here, let's see. I think I have some images somewhere. 1 second. Where did I put these? One sec. Oh yeah, here we go. So open that. So let's wait, that's conjunction. Let's do or, right? And there's only usually 5 operators, so we won't go through them all, but like this is the idea, right? So like here's like
and
alpha
or not. What are the other ones?
Yeah, there's exactly, yeah, right. So there's not, there's and, there's or, there's sometimes exclusive or, because this or is like and or, and then there's and, right? So usually implication, there's biconditional, which is the one we had an argument about that one time. And then there's which for the record is not circular. It's P implies Q and Q implies P. That's not a circle. It's just a biconditional. But yeah, the or one right here, this is and or. So I mean, you can probably intuitively guess like when this would be true, right? It's like A and or B. Like when would you think it's going to be true? Well, it's obviously true when they're both true. It's obviously true when at least one of them is true. It's only going to be false if A and B are both false. So what I kind of want to show you is just how do I minimize this window?
I have no idea.
Yeah, like that. No, okay. I just want to show you how to look at this and then figure out the truth values for that. So this statement right here, P or Q, just like here, alpha or beta, you can tell from the values of alpha and beta when the disjunction, which Jay doesn't know the meaning of, ends up being true, right?
Yep.
So we can tell, it's true when A and B are both true when one or the other is true. It's only false when both are false. So if you look at something like this, P or Q, well, it's pretty easy to determine, right? So in the first row, it's going to be true because P and Q are both true. In second row, it's going to be true because at least one of them's true, P or Q, right? One of them's true. Third row, one of them's true also. In the fourth row, one of them's false. And then you already know how to get the value for not Q, how to get the value for P. Then you can just generate it and see if it's valid. So yeah, I just thought that would also be a useful thing. Like obviously, like more could be said about that, but it's like useful to have because so often people just give you these completely garbage arguments where there's just no structure to it. And like forcing a structure then allows you to really carefully zero in on the premises and then force like further structure for arguments leading up to those premises. And it makes it like very satisfyingly linear.
Yeah, I definitely agree. There is value in assessing it for someone who really understands the logic, but in a debate format where most of the people watching don't understand it and aren't going to follow that long into an argument, and the person you're talking with probably doesn't either, it's not as compelling as a counter argument as some of the more rhetorical tactics. And so I usually prefer those, and I didn't spend as much time going into logical analysis. I just got bored with it. It wasn't as useful in a debate format to me. So it's definitely useful if you're talking with a professional in the field who definitely acknowledges the value of it. But other than that, I haven't found it as useful in a live debate format.
Yeah, well, this is the thing. So here's one of my thoughts. So like, I think there's truth to that, right? Like rhetoric plays better than actually just like cracking out the logic and just like kind of like forcing the debate into that terrain. But what I hope for is actually a shift in the meta. So like right now, I think the debate meta is like hilarious. It's like, people just like in a lot of empirical debates on YouTube, people just appeal to authorities, cite studies at each other, don't know how to compare studies or like, if they have separate metas, how to create a meta using like, one of those apps like RevMan or something. In philosophy
Wait,
debates.
what was that? What was the app? What does the app do?
I believe it's called RevMan. So like, here's a thing. So like, sometimes in empirical debates, there's the evidence hierarchy. It's like, you have like at the bottom, you have like anecdotes or garbage, then like case studies, kind of like, better anecdote. And then you have like cohort studies. Then you have like, meta-analyses, systematic reviews. And then up at the top, you have like, stuff like meta-analyses or like, you can understand there's a hierarchy of evidence there, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, obviously this, but
what does the program do with does it just make this? And like,
I was about to say what it does and when it's useful. So like I was just going to describe when it's useful first, which is just like, so often you get in a situation where they have their meta and you have your meta.
Yeah, I was actually specifically thinking about like my recent debate with what's his name on Black Lives Matter, and we're both citing different studies about like is the African Americans shot at a disproportionate rate to the crime rate or whatever, and which of the studies are more relevant. That was the example I was thinking of, and how would I be able to use this in that context?
Okay, so I guess the first question is, were both of you citing studies at the same level on the hierarchy? Because you might not even have to if yours are from a higher place in the hierarchy.
I have no idea. That was the question, like how would we assess this?
Well, so this is basically, so first of all, Avi is the one who's really good with this stuff. He's the person to talk to, and he's very generous with his time. I'm sure you can message him.
Sure, sounds good. But just a quick question, like what is the hierarchy here? Because if they're both like, would it be number of citations, journal that it's published in? How would you assess the hierarchy? If they're like actually academic published papers, not just citing some garbage blog.
Well, I think that the hierarchy is just for types of evidence. So like you might have like meta-analyses, you might have like cohort studies, and the hierarchy is just broadly tiering those kind of categories. So like
Gotcha.
If they're cracking out like cohort studies and you're cracking out metas, you can just say like, look, my evidence is just higher on the hierarchy. You're kind of like BTFO'd here.
Right.
But to answer your question now, sorry to be roundabout about it, but you sometimes get in a situation, and a good example of this, although it's not probably up your alley, there's a nutrition debate on Joe Rogan between Joel Kahn, who's kind of like a pretty sketchy vegan MD, and Chris Kresser, who's like an even sketchier, like kind of omnivore guy. It's not a doctor, but they were both cracking out meta-analyses, and Kahn didn't know how to deal with Kresser's. And sometimes you have a move accessible to you, like there's actually a problem with the guy's study and you can get it off the table. But when you just both have a meta and they point in different directions, it's like, what do you do? Well, there's apps like RevMan, and someone like Avi could show you how to use it. And you can actually input all the data and generate a meta analysis. And then that's just such a BTFO move, because like then you're just like, oh, well, you know what? Like I've combined our studies and the aggregate results in my favor. Like, what are you going to do now?
Yeah. Has that been like peer reviewed as an app that actually works, or is it just kind of like a cool thing?
I think it's just a standard application for doing like statistical analysis. Like it's like a kind of like standard tool that statisticians use. Like when you see studies that build like, they have like tree graphs built into them and all this kind of stuff, like they generate all those graphs using applications like that, where they input data and then it'll generate some kind of like graph or something out of it, right? I don't know the ins and outs of RevMan, but it's just like a standard app that statisticians use.
Well, that's one of the big debates in statistics, is using Bayesian versus classical statistical analysis, and which one is better in certain instances, and what are the priors and what are best to use. So I've actually been debating this with Luke Barnes on Twitter a bunch, trying to figure out how to actually assess his use of Bayes, indicating a designer for fine tuning is wrong. And so it's a really complicated topic.
Yeah, I mean, if Avi's on, I'll bring him on for a second, because he is just like vastly more knowledgeable than me about this kind of stuff. But what was I going to say? Yeah, it was just this all came out of just talking about the debate meta, right? Which is just cringy right now. Like in empirical debates, people just cite studies at each other, appeal to authority, and if they have something at the same level on the evidence hierarchy, they're just fucked. Or like in philosophical debates, barely anyone actually uses logic. People who do often totally BTFO the other side, but the audience doesn't track it, right? And like the whole thing is, like UFC?
Yeah, the fighting.
Yeah, like I mean, so I don't know much about the UFC, but the impression I'm under is like initially when the UFC sort of started, people would come in with these like radically different styles. Like you'd have some guy coming in who's like just like
Muay
a
Thai
like
versus Kung Fu versus the Chinese
right.
martial arts, akimbo. Yeah,
But as the meta in UFC developed, it became obvious that you had to have minimally some ability to fight on the ground. Because if you got taken down by one of the jiu-jitsu guys, like if you don't know any ground fighting, you're just fucked. It doesn't matter how good you are on your feet. You're not getting back up and you're just basically screwed, right?
yep.
So now if you look at any UFC fighter, it's like they have some level of ground training. They might not have the kind of ground training where they can contest an expert ground fighter, but like minimally enough to try to like get off the ground if they end up on the ground, right? Because it just wasn't viable in the meta to have no ground training, right? It's just too high liability. So what I kind of hope is that an analogous thing will happen with debate. So I understand what you're saying of you want to just, kind of, I guess you would just act within whatever the current meta is. If rhetoric is useful, then use rhetoric. If logic is useful, then use logic. But my take is we need to actually progress the meta. So I'm an early adopter. I'm going, we bring in the proper logic. We force people into a formalized kind of debate procedure. If audiences don't like it, they can eat a dick. We're going to push this through, and eventually people just understand that you get BTFO'd if you don't know this stuff, and the meta will shift. That's kind of my potentially delusional hope, but that's what I try to do.
Yeah, I definitely think that would be cool. I think that there is value in understanding the logic, and I think it's definitely a useful metric, but I don't think that's going to happen. I think that popularity wins out, and what's going to be popular in arguments is what can emotionally engage the audience, not what is the most logical always. That's why scientists are really terrible in debates because they don't know how to articulate their ideas in an emotionally compelling way as compared to like young earth creationists or Nathan Thompson, the flat earther guy. They do really well in debates because of their confidence and their way of expressing things. So even though their arguments are dumb as shit, they sound good, and that gets people emotionally engaged, which gets them a lot of followers. And I think that is such an ingrained part of human nature. I don't think the logic is ever going to overcome that and be the more important part of a debate format, unless it's going to be like academic kind of formal college debate kind of a thing, which could potentially adopt that as a rule system. But in public debates like this, I don't think it's going to work.
There's already some communities though where the norms are changing, right? Like in the kind of communities that I exist in, a lot of the Phil communities, just on Discord, right? It's not even like strictly academic. It's like there's a general understanding of the usefulness of logic, and when one guy's floundering with respect to logic, it's just seen as cringe, and the audience is like, oh my god, like the fail level, right? So I don't know if it's impossible to spread that into broader kind of debate communities. Like imagine if some of the top tier debaters who are just really good started making good use of logic. You really think it would be that hard to spread that kind of norm in some of the debate spheres online?
Yeah, I do. I think that it's kind of the same idea as religion versus logic or humanism. It's a lot more difficult to spread ideas, even if they're significantly better ideas, if they don't have that intuitive emotional grasp to them. That's why people watch more cat videos than they do Alex Malpass and Ozzy and all the other big atheists and the Stanford like online courses. They just offer free courses for people, but people aren't interested in that because it isn't as emotionally engaging. And I think it's the same dichotomy between religion and interesting scientific facts. It's just because it's a part of ingrained in human nature, those harder to understand methodologies, even if they're better, probably won't gain the same traction as the emotional just pulls of silly arguments and things that sound good.
I guess we'll just have to see, because I've seen it spread within specific communities, and I'm not convinced that it's like a fool's errand to try to spread better debate norms in like kind of broader debate communities than just this philosophy space. But I mean, we're both kind of just, like, we have our intuitions, and we'll just have to see what happens. But either way, I think even if I knew that there's no hope of changing the meta, which I'm not convinced of, but even if I thought there was no hope, I would continue in my ways, because I just fundamentally place higher value on being accurate and being clear than rhetoric.
Yeah,
But
I definitely I see value in it. I don't think it's a wasted effort. But I think one thing you could do is do something like modern day debate does, and start like a debate circuit where this is like one of the requirements in the debate that you have to be able to do this to some degree. And that might be able to create enough of a community to centered around that, and that could teach the other people who don't actually know it at the same time to be able to build that as an ideology.
Yeah, well, we have kind of done that to some degree on Discord, and we actually have roles and stuff now that you can get if you can complete the like generated bot test. It can generate infinite, or not infinite, like trillions, I think, of different unique tests. So we try to incentivize it, but yeah, I hear that. I feel like there's one more thing I was going to say. Oh yeah, I mean, we're getting a little off topic, but just with respect to debate norms, like, you know, there's other things like what I have complaints about modding. Like there's lots of mods who don't mod based on content. Like when one person is pressing with a question, they mod based on time spent speaking. I don't like that one. I don't know how you feel about that one.
Well, I mean, I don't have that problem because James doesn't mod at all, pretty much. He just sits there and just... He's not as bad as that guy on the kill stream who just literally would not mute him. Like, wow, that was so bad.
Yeah, that was pretty funny. And then the only other one is... oh yeah, so I do get triggered by audiences who have aversion to the following two things, which are semantic analysis and formalization of arguments. So like people don't understand, and like you and I, we're gonna have one of these conversations sometime about the moral semantics, but oftentimes exploring how someone's defining their terms is going to be more important than exploring their argument, because it's like something can be getting smuggled in the definitions, or there can be an ambiguity or a contradiction that's, or like some kind of like, yeah, I guess like analytic problem is just going to ultimately be a contradiction that's existing at like the definitional level, where it's like if you were to just force the debate forward onto talking about the arguments without getting clarity on those things, you'd be in a bad situation. Or similarly,
well, yeah, one really big example of that is God. Just the term God has so many of those just ingrained in it, and just, yeah, that's exactly the example of what you're going for. But at the same time, like, even if you did go down that path, people would just be, no, he's God. He can totally do that and not a problem. Who cares if there's logical contradictions? It's only apparent logical contradictions. Human logic can't comprehend the power of God.
Yeah, that's a major cringe-a-thon. Or with formalization, here's part of also why I think it's so important. I don't know if you've had this kind of thing happen, but occasionally you'll get someone giving you an argument where the conclusion doesn't follow and insisting you debate the truth of the premises. You're like, well, what the fuck? Like, what's the point of that? They could both be true, and we don't know it guarantees the conclusion. So why would we do that? The form doesn't make sense, right? But audiences will often get triggered if you want to go into the actual form. Bringing it back to the topic, Jay's audience despises it, right? If you try to make that guy clarify his argument form, it's just AIDS. They hate it, but it's like, okay, well, you know, we got to do that. Or if you make him clarify terms, right? Semantic analysis. It's like, what do you think it means to talk about, like, you know, a transcendental? What defines that category? It's like those kind of questions. It's like he'll just give you some examples, and you'll be like, okay, but are you just picking random things, or is there some kind of thread that ties those all together, like a category definition you can give? And it's like, if you can't answer that, he's just going to try to throw examples at you and move on. It's like, well, you know, what the fuck? So
yeah, that happens a lot also in the God debate. Like me and Aaron had a debate with Cliff and Stewart, something, I forget their last name, but yeah, it's really useful in those debates to do the semantic analysis. Like, what do you mean by supernatural? Like, what is that category? Why can you have free will on supernatural but not natural? What's the difference between them?
I almost commented on that in that exact debate, because I actually watched that one. Funny enough.
My apologies. My condolences.
Yeah, it's okay. I forgive you. But I don't remember the exact thread, because I wasn't watching this carefully like the J one. This was like background noise when I was cooking. But he was saying that there's an immaterial soul that's physical, and it's like, wait, but
natural. He said natural. He said, like, there's a natural soul, but then he said God also has a soul, but God is supernatural.
Well, but even without bringing in the statement about God, it's like we need to do a semantic analysis there, because when you say that there is a natural non-physical object, you know, that seems confused. Like normally natural is taken to like refer to things that are physical. So like if there's something that's natural and non-physical, maybe you can make sense of that, but we need to kind of get a sense of how you're using those words to even know if you're not just contradicting yourself ultimately when you're saying that it's natural and non-physical.
Yeah, I definitely understand that. I mean, but the philosophical literature, there's a big debate between natural and supernatural and how the term is ambiguous, and Capturing Christianity brings that up a lot. He hates the distinction because of that. So I can understand that position from a theistic side on that one word.
Oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
Yeah, well, I was just going to say, Capturing Christianity, I saw him post a syllogism. I always get interested when I see them posting some logic shit. And I thought it was hilarious in your Jay debate when he gave you this argument and you realized like it's not valid or there's some problem. You're like, oh my God, if Ask Yourself were here, like, as in like I'd just be laughing at it or something, which I'm sure I would.
Yeah. It's like, we got to bring Ask Yourself in. This is going to be hilarious.
I would get triggered, I'm sure. But yeah, he if you see Capturing Christianity, he posted an argument a few days ago, and I was talking to Rationality Rules briefly.
Was it like one of his serious ones or one of his joke ones?
No, it was serious. So it's God exists necessarily or is impossible. God is not impossible, therefore God exists necessarily. But it's like when we do a little bit of semantic analysis on those terms, right? It's like, well, something exists necessarily if and only if its non-existence entails a contradiction. And something is impossible if and only if its existence entails a contradiction. So it's like, I wonder why he thinks that God's non-existence entails a contradiction or his existence entails a contradiction. Why would we have a disjunction between those two propositions? Once you get rid of the words necessary and impossible, and you say entails a contradiction or doesn't entail a contradiction, it's like, wait, you're saying either God's non-existence entails a contradiction or his existence entails a contradiction? Why is that? What the fuck is the argument for that?
Well, yeah, that would be just another one of those examples earlier of how it's just affirming the consequent, because it's even if, for example, either he's necessarily existent or he's impossible. Well, you could just take that for any object. Well, even an apple is necessarily existent or it's not impossible. Why would this be a problem? What is the difference here?
Okay, wait, I don't see how it's affirming consequent, because it is just a disjunctive syllogism. It's just P or Q, not Q, therefore P.
It's just asserting that because either he's like, it's a false dichotomy. So either he's necessarily the case or it's impossible he's the case. It's just possible.
Yeah, that I agree with.
So that would be the way I should have phrased it. So you can just pick anything. Like, so either an apple necessarily exists or it's logically impossible. It's not logically impossible. Therefore the apple necessarily exists.
Yeah, but it's like, why would we accept the claim that either an apple, either its non-existence entails a contradiction or its existence entails a contradiction? Why would we think that? Like, what the fuck would the argument for that? So it's just
I mean, that's just classic Thomism, where you think God is by definition a necessary being, and so either that is the case or there has to be some logical contradiction in that argument. And that's essentially the point I think he's trying to make.
Well, wait, when you define him, are we trying to deduce that he's necessary or define him as necessary? Because something
he's just
necessary.
Defining him. So he's just saying this is a conclusion of other arguments. God is a necessary being. So either God is a necessary being and exists necessarily, or there has to be some kind of a logical contradiction, and there isn't a logical contradiction. Therefore, the necessary stuff is all correct.
Well, to show that something exists necessarily, you'd have to show that its non-existence entails a contradiction.
Unless you're using the ontological argument. It's just...
How do you mean? Well, wait, I don't think there's an exception in that case. I think any time that you're saying something exists necessarily, I just take necessary to refer to logical necessity.
Well, yeah, that's the point of the ontological argument, is that you can somehow define things into existence without just proving their logical necessity. So it's like God is the greatest conceivable being. A being that exists is greater than a being that is purely imaginary. Therefore, the greatest conceivable being exists. So it's somehow the ontological argument has this magical way of trying to overcome exactly what you're saying, which no one in philosophy accepts other than theists. But that's essentially what they're trying to do, is overcome that limitation.
Well, yeah, I mean, all I could say is that if something's necessary, you have to actually show the contradiction that's entailed by the non-existence of the thing. Like, do you think there is any such contradiction to be demonstrated? Why am I even asking you? You're the atheist debater guy. Yeah. But presumably you don't think there's any such contradiction to be demonstrated with God.
Right. So I don't understand why they think that works, but that is their argument, that they think that they can somehow define God as necessary and make him exist from the definition somehow. Until that's...
There's also there's a hilarious version of the ontological argument, which I'm sure you've seen, which is the modal ontological argument. Have you seen that?
Plantinga's version?
Yes. Yeah. So there's I think that I'm referring to Plantinga's version, because there's one version of the MOA where one of the premises is, what is it? It's possible that God exists necessarily, right?
Yep,
But,
yep, that's the one.
In S5 modal logic, it's just an entailment of the statement that something is possibly necessary, that it's actually necessary. So
Yep.
it turns the whole argument into just a one premise argument where the premise isn't substantiated.
I actually brought that up in my debate with Ben Arbor. I did a live debate with him in Texas, and at the end during the Q&A, I asked, is it possible for God to possibly exist and possible for him to not exist at the same time given S5 logic? And obviously you can't, because if it's possible he exists given S5 logic, it necessarily means he exists. So he has to reject that claim.
Sorry, there's confusion. If it's possibly necessary,
right,
then it's necessary.
Well, since it's God, he is necessary. So is it possible God exists and God is a necessary being by definition?
Okay, sure.
Then it would be, and you can't be both the case that it is possible God exists and possible God does not exist, which shows the ambiguity of what they're doing with the word possible.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, it's just hilarious. I mean, look, we've gotten way off in the weeds, but I thoroughly enjoyed this conversation, though, Tom. It's nice to talk to you in a non-argumentative context. We'll have to argue again soon, though. We'll do the moral. Well, to be fair, I don't know if it'll turn into an argument when we do the moral semantics, because it might just be that you have some semantic that I just end up going, okay, like I understand what you mean, and that's just not how I use the words. Or I might say, okay, wait, I think there's a problem. But yeah, we'll do that sometime, maybe.
Yeah, check out my most recent conversation on objective morality, because I think I do a pretty good job of explaining it in that one. And I'll send you the paper on vicious and virtuous circularity.
Sounds good. Okay, I had fun talking to you. Keep well, dude.
Had fun talking to you too. Talk.